The house stood at the edge of a small village where the air smelled faintly of pine and rain. Beyond its garden stretched the valley, and beyond that, the faint outline of a lake that looked silver under moonlight. Inside that house lived an artist named Elias, who spent most of his days surrounded by quietness so complete that even his own breath sometimes startled him. He had once lived in the city, where the sound of trams and people filled every hour. He had painted the noise, the color, the movement. He had filled canvases with crowds and music and restless light. But something in him grew weary, not of the art, but of the endless hum that lived beneath everything. He began to long for the kind of silence that could be heard, the kind that held 1,000 soft things inside it. And so, one morning, he packed his brushes and paints, left behind the narrow streets of the city, and came to this valley where time seemed to slow to a sigh. The cottage had once belonged to a shepherd. The windows were uneven, the walls thick with age, but when Elias first stepped inside, the quiet embraced him like a forgotten song. He began to paint again, but the subjects changed. The first canvas was a simple one, the empty field at dawn, pale and still. He mixed colors softly, using gray, muted green, and the gentlest blue. Yet when he finished, something was missing. The painting was beautiful, but it did not breathe. It did not hold that stillness he felt in his bones. He tried again the next day. And the next. He painted the mountains, the sky, the reflection of the moon on the lake. Each time, he captured what he saw, but not what he heard. The silence had a sound here, subtle and alive, and he could not paint it. One night, he sat before his canvas long after midnight. The lamp flickered. The only sound was the clock, ticking softly as though it feared to disturb him. Outside, a faint wind moved through the pines, carrying with it a cool scent of earth and resin. He closed his eyes and listened. The world did not seem empty. It was full of space, of breath, of waiting. It was a silence that seemed to speak. When he opened his eyes again, he whispered to himself, "That's what I must paint." Not the light, not the shape, but the waiting between sounds. He didn't know how to begin. But his hands, as always, knew more than his thoughts. He picked up a brush and dipped it into a faint wash of blue-gray. The canvas accepted it quietly, as though it too understood something beyond words. The strokes were soft, uncertain, blending into one another like mist. He painted without thinking, listening instead to the soft rhythm of his breathing. Time fell away. When dawn came and the first bird sang, he looked at the canvas and felt something stir. The painting was nearly empty. Only a faint horizon, a suggestion of light, a whisper of shape. But it felt alive. For the first time, he felt he had painted not what he saw, but what he felt. The sound of stillness. He left it on the easel and went for a walk. The morning mist rolled over the fields, and the grass was heavy with dew. He moved slowly, not wanting to disturb the quiet. Even his footsteps felt too loud. A hare darted from the bushes and disappeared down the slope. Elias smiled softly. Even that motion, that brief disruption, felt like part of the stillness. When he returned, he made tea and sat by the window, looking at the painting. It looked different now, in daylight. Calmer, deeper. As though the silence inside it had thickened, grown richer. He felt no urge to change it. He simply watched it, as one might watch the sea. Days passed in this way. He painted the air after rain, the faint shimmer of dust and sunlight, the stillness before evening. He found a rhythm, not a schedule, but a kind of breathing between himself and the world. Paint. Walk. Listen. Sleep. Each day folded into the next like waves on the shore. One evening, an old woman from the village came by. Her name was Marin, and she sold honey and herbs. She had been curious about the new painter who lived alone in the hills. Elias welcomed her in and made tea. She walked slowly through the room, looking at the canvases leaned against the walls. "They are very quiet," she said finally. Elias smiled. "That's what I want them to be." Marin nodded thoughtfully. "Quiet can be loud, you know, when you listen long enough." He looked at her, surprised. "That's exactly what I've been thinking." She smiled, eyes crinkling. "Then you'll fit well here. The valley teaches you how to hear silence, but not everyone wants to learn." Before she left, she gave him a small jar of honey. "For sweetness," she said. "Even silence needs sweetness." That night, Elias painted again. He mixed a little of the honey into his paint, just a drop, a strange impulse he didn't quite understand. The scent filled the air as he worked, soft and comforting. The brush moved more freely than before. He painted a meadow under dusk, with the faintest trace of gold along the horizon. And somehow, though there were no figures, no sound, no movement, the painting seemed to hum quietly, like the memory of a lullaby. He slept deeply that night, the window open to the soft night air. In his dream, he stood inside a vast gallery, filled with paintings that made no sound, yet each one resonated like a chord beneath the heart. He woke with a strange calmness, as though he had touched something sacred. From that morning onward, he began to think that silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. Every moment he spent listening, truly listening, became part of his art. He began to see the small things that others missed, the weight of a leaf falling, the pause between two bird calls, the sigh of wind across a still pond. These became his colors. As weeks turned to months, his cottage filled with these quiet paintings. The villagers began to visit, curious about the strange man who painted the invisible. Some left puzzled, others stayed long, unable to look away. A farmer once stood before a canvas for nearly an hour, then said softly, "It feels like being inside my own heartbeat." Elias only smiled. That was enough. He stopped trying to name what he was doing. He no longer thought of success or failure, of showing his work in the city again. The valley had changed him. He had come searching for silence, and instead found himself inside it, not as an intruder, but as part of it. One winter morning, he woke to find the world covered in snow. Everything was white, muffled, slow. The trees bowed under the weight, the roof shimmered with frost. He stepped outside and felt the cold air touch his face. The silence was deeper than ever, not empty, but infinite. It pressed gently against his chest, filling him with a peace he could not describe. He returned indoors, lit a candle, and began to paint again. The brush moved so lightly it barely whispered against the canvas. The strokes seemed to appear of their own accord, like breath fading into glass. He painted until the candle burned out, until the snow outside began to glow blue with dawn. When he finally stepped back, he looked at what he had made, and tears filled his eyes. The painting was almost nothing, a field of pale tones, a single soft line where sky met snow. But within that emptiness, he felt everything. It was as though the silence of the world had finally found its shape. He called it still morning. And for the first time in his life, he did not feel alone. Days began to drift like feathers in slow air. Elias no longer counted them. He painted when light touched the room in the right way, when the stillness felt ready to be held. Sometimes he painted at dawn, when fog brushed the windows, and sometimes late at night, when the world slept and time itself seemed to pause. He had stopped forcing anything, he only followed what the silence asked of him. Each morning he woke to soft light filtering through the curtains. The valley was a different shade every day, sometimes silver, sometimes green, sometimes pale gold. He would sit by the window for a long while before moving, listening to the faint groan of the old wood, to the heartbeat of quiet that never really ended. There was something sacred about this slowness. Even his tea seemed to steep more deeply, the warmth sinking into him like light into earth. The villagers came and went. They brought small gifts, fresh bread, wool, a jar of preserved cherries, and took home stories about the painter who lived with silence. Some said he could paint the soul of the wind, others said he'd gone half mad from solitude. Elias didn't mind the rumors. He had stopped belonging to words a long time ago. One evening, as he walked toward the lake, he saw a girl sitting by the water's edge. She was perhaps 16, with hair the color of wheat and eyes that reflected the dimming sky. She held a notebook on her knees but wasn't writing. She was listening, as he often did. Elias watched her for a while before speaking softly. "It's quiet tonight," he said. She turned, startled, but when she saw his gentle face, she smiled faintly. "It's my favorite kind of quiet," she answered. "The kind that feels alive." He nodded. "That's the only kind that matters." They sat together for a while without speaking, the silence between them growing comfortable. After some time, she said, "I come here to draw, but sometimes I can't. It feels like the stillness is already perfect. Anything I add feels like too much." Elias looked out at the water. "Maybe what you draw isn't meant to add," he said. "Maybe it's meant to listen." She considered this, then nodded. "You paint, don't you?" "I've seen your house." He smiled. "I try." "My name's Leora," she said softly. They talked a little more, about nothing in particular, and when she left, Elias felt a strange warmth in the air. It wasn't loneliness that filled him anymore, but a quiet companionship that had no need for words. That night, he painted the lake. Not as it was, but as it felt, the still shimmer, the breath between ripples, the faint echo of another soul nearby. The result was unlike anything he had made before. It glowed faintly even in the dark, as though it remembered moonlight. Over the following weeks, Leora returned. Sometimes she brought her sketches to show him, lines as delicate as wind trails. Sometimes she just sat in silence while he painted. They rarely spoke much, but their stillness together had its own language. One afternoon, she asked, "Why do you paint silence?" Elias looked up from his work. "Because silence is where everything begins," he said. "Before sound, before thought, it's all there, waiting." She frowned thoughtfully. "Do you think silence can break?" He smiled sadly. "Only when we stop listening." She nodded as if she understood more than her years allowed. As winter melted into spring, the snow retreated, revealing wet fields and streams that whispered through the meadows. Elias began to paint outdoors, taking his easel down near the water. He noticed new sounds, the distant bleating of sheep, the drip of melting ice, the soft hum of thawing earth. The silence had changed, but it was still there, deeper than any sound. One day, Marin visited again. Her basket smelled of herbs and sunlight. She looked at his new paintings and said, "They're lighter now. Not as lonely." Elias smiled. "Perhaps the silence has company." Marin's eyes softened. "Maybe it's you who has company." He thought about Leora, about the warmth that entered his small cottage when she came by, about how even her quiet breaths seemed to fold into the stillness rather than disturb it. "Maybe," he said. That night, rain began to fall, steady and soft. He sat by the open window and listened to it for hours. The rhythm of the drops became part of his breathing. He thought of how silence was never truly alone. It held every sound gently, giving it shape. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was the cradle for it. He picked up his brush and began to paint again, not the rain itself, but the hush beneath it, the way each drop carried a memory of calm. The canvas grew darker, deeper, alive with layers of quiet movement. When he stepped back, he saw not rain but rest, the kind of rest the world forgets it needs. Word of his work began to spread beyond the village. A traveler passing through bought one of his smaller paintings, a gray field under morning fog, and took it to the city. It hung in a cafe for a while, where people would pause, mid-sentence, without knowing why. Some said it made them feel as though they'd just taken a breath after holding it for too long. Letters began to arrive for Elias, carried by the postman who came once a week. Gallery owners, collectors, people who'd heard whispers of the painter who painted silence. They wanted to meet him, to buy his works, to bring him back to the city. Elias read their words with a soft smile, then folded the letters neatly and placed them in a drawer. The silence here was too precious to trade. But one letter was different. It was written on handmade paper, in elegant, gentle handwriting. It said only, "Your paintings sound like peace. If you ever wish to share the silence with others, I can help you do it quietly." It was signed, simply, Adrian. Elias read it several times. Something in those words felt kind, unhurried, like an echo that belonged in his valley. Still, he didn't reply. He had no desire for crowds or exhibitions. His silence was not meant to be performed. It was meant to be lived. That evening, Leora came again, bringing a bouquet of wildflowers. She saw the letter on his table. "Will you go?" she asked. He shook his head. "Silence doesn't travel well." She smiled. "Maybe. But sometimes it follows where it's needed." He looked at her then, really looked, and realized she was right. Silence wasn't a place. It was something carried inside, like breath. That night, he couldn't sleep. The moonlight spread across the floor, cold and clear. He lay awake, thinking of the world beyond the hills, the people rushing, the constant hum, the noise. Maybe they, too, needed a reminder of stillness. Maybe silence could be shared without losing its soul. The next morning, he began a new painting. It was unlike the others, larger, brighter, filled with light. He painted not emptiness but invitation, a quiet space one could step into and rest. As he worked, he thought of those who might one day see it, those whose hearts were tired of noise. It took him weeks to finish. When he finally did, he stood before it, unsure whether to keep it or send it away. The painting seemed to hum softly, like the moment before dawn. Leora came to see it and gasped. "It feels like breathing," she whispered. Elias nodded. "That's what I wanted." She touched the edge of the frame gently. "You should let others breathe it too." And so, at last, he wrote a letter to Adrian, the one who had written with quiet understanding. He wrote slowly, simply, "If silence can travel gently, then let it go. But only if it returns home." Weeks later, a reply came, brief and kind, "It will. Always." Spring came quietly that year, as though afraid to disturb the painter's work. The valley woke in slow breaths, snowmelt whispering down the slopes, wildflowers pushing through the dark earth, the faint return of birdsong that seemed to echo from a distance. Elias felt each change like a note in a slow melody. He painted less feverishly now. He had learned that silence didn't like to be chased. It preferred to be found. He spent long hours by the window, sketching with charcoal on pale paper. Sometimes he didn't lift the pencil for minutes. He would wait, watching how the light softened the wall, how a shadow trembled as the wind shifted outside. There was always movement, even in stillness, but it was gentle, like the world breathing. A few weeks after he sent his letter, a man arrived at the cottage. He came walking from the road that wound through the hills, wearing a long dark coat and carrying a wooden case. He stopped at the gate and looked around for a while before knocking softly on the door. Elias opened it, blinking at the brightness of the afternoon. The man smiled faintly. "You must be Elias," he said. "I'm Adrian." Elias nodded, recognizing the name. "You came far." Adrian shrugged lightly. silence is worth the distance. They shared tea by the open window. The visitor spoke little, which pleased Elias. He looked around the room slowly, studying each painting without comment. After a long while, he said quietly, "They're not just images. They feel like pauses, like the space between two heartbeats." Elias smiled. "That's what I hoped for." Adrian took a sip of tea. "I don't want to take them from you, but I'd like to help you share them with others who need to remember how to breathe." Elias tilted his head. "Without noise?" "Without noise," Adrian promised. He spoke of a small gallery in the city, quiet, candlelit, with music so soft it barely touched the ear. A place where people came not to talk but to listen. He wanted to dedicate a single room to Elias's works, to let people stand in front of them and feel their own silence awaken. Elias hesitated. "If I send them away," he said softly, "will they lose their stillness?" Adrian smiled. "If they were painted with silence, it will travel with them. People will hear it." They talked late into the evening. The candles burned down to wax puddles. The wind brushed against the window like a sigh. Finally, Elias agreed. He would send a few paintings, not the newest ones, not the ones that still felt alive and breathing, but some of the earlier works, the ones that carried the first tremors of quiet. When Adrian left a few days later, his wooden case held 5 paintings wrapped in linen. The morning light touched the case as he walked away, and Elias felt a strange ache, like watching something invisible take flight. For several weeks, nothing changed. The cottage was still, the valley the same. But Elias noticed something new within himself, an awareness that his silence now existed elsewhere too, moving through the hearts of strangers. He found comfort in that thought. Perhaps silence was never meant to be kept. One evening, as the first summer rain began to fall, a letter arrived. It was from Adrian. They came, it read, and they stopped speaking. Some stayed for hours. One woman wept quietly, saying it felt like remembering someone she had never met. Another man said he heard the sound of snow when he looked. "Your silence is working." Elias read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it on the table beside his brushes. He felt a quiet joy, like the opening of a small door inside him. That night, he walked out into the rain without a coat. The drops touched his face softly, cooling his skin, and the scent of wet earth rose around him. He thought of the people in the city, standing before his paintings, feeling the hush he had felt here, and it made him smile. Perhaps silence was not so fragile after all. Over the next months, letters arrived regularly. Adrian sent small notes, sometimes enclosing comments from those who visited the gallery. One said, "It feels like standing at the edge of something vast and kind." Another, "I saw my own thoughts quiet down." Elias began to imagine them, these unseen souls finding stillness. He painted with them in mind, not out of vanity, but out of kinship. He no longer painted for himself alone, but for the shared quiet between hearts. Leora noticed the change. One afternoon she came by with a sketchbook under her arm and said, "Your silence feels different now." "How so?" Elias asked. "It's warmer," she said. "Like it's been touched by other people's quiet." He smiled. "Maybe silence grows that way, by being shared." She nodded, thoughtful. "Do you think you'll ever go back to the city?" He looked toward the hills, glowing gold in the late sun. "Perhaps one day. But not to live there. Maybe just to listen." Summer deepened. The valley filled with the hum of life, bees, crickets, the rustle of leaves. Elias found that even in all that sound, there was still silence underneath, steady as a heartbeat. He began to paint light differently now, not just pale or dim, but alive, pulsing softly through color like breath. His canvases glowed faintly at dusk, as if holding some inner warmth. One morning, a package arrived from Adrian. Inside were photographs, the gallery, softly lit, his paintings hanging like windows to another world. In one picture, people stood quietly before them, hands folded, eyes closed. In another, a child sat cross-legged on the floor, staring up at the largest canvas with an expression of wonder. On the back of that photo, Adrian had written, "Even the children are listening." Elias sat for a long time, studying the photographs. The thought that silence could speak across distance filled him with quiet gratitude. He felt no pride, only a deep sense of belonging, as though he and the world had finally found the same rhythm. That night, he dreamed again, the gallery from his old dream, filled with paintings that made no sound, yet each one resonated like a secret prayer. But this time, he was not alone inside it. There were others, figures moving gently, their faces serene. He could feel their breathing. The silence was shared. When he woke, dawn was just breaking. He rose and stepped outside. Mist drifted across the fields, carrying the smell of damp grass. Somewhere far off, a bird called once and then was quiet again. Elias stood still, letting the cool air fill him. He whispered, "Thank you," though he didn't know to whom. Perhaps to the silence itself. Time moved on softly. The year turned again. Leora grew older, her drawings more assured, more patient. She began to talk of leaving for the city, to study art. Elias listened, proud and a little sad. "You'll find your own silence there," he told her. "I'll try," she said. "But I think part of mine will always sound like here." Before she left, she gave him a small painting of her own, the lake under moonlight, rendered in tender shades of silver and gray. It was delicate, trembling with feeling. On the back, she had written one sentence, "Silence learns from those who listen." He hung it beside his window. Sometimes, when he painted, he looked at it and smiled. As autumn returned, the air cooled and the valley began to turn gold and rust. Elias's days grew quieter again, but it was a fuller quiet, not lonely, not empty. His silence was now shared by others, living quietly within them. The thought made him peaceful. One evening, just before the first frost, he walked down to the lake alone. The water was still, holding the reflection of the first stars. He sat on a flat stone and listened. The silence was deep, endless, but not cold. It held every sound he'd ever known, the wind, the rain, the faint echo of Leora's laughter, the whispers of strangers in the gallery, the soft scrape of his own brush. It was all there, folded inside the quiet. He closed his eyes and felt the world breathe around him. And in that breath, he knew that he had never really been alone, that silence had always been alive, waiting for someone to notice it. He whispered, barely moving his lips, "I hear you." And the silence, vast and tender, seemed to answer back. The winters grew longer after Leora left. The snow lingered well into March, and the river froze so solid that the foxes left their prints on its glassy surface. Elias stayed mostly indoors during those months, keeping the fire burning, painting when the light was kind enough to enter. The silence had grown deeper, more mature, no longer fragile, but wide and steady, like an old friend. He often thought of Leora in the city. Sometimes a letter would come, smudged by travel, filled with small descriptions, the hum of the market, the gray of wet streets, the smell of paint in the studio. She always ended with a simple line, "I found a small silence today. I painted it for you." He would smile, imagining her in a crowded place, finding a pocket of stillness among the noise. He felt proud, not as a teacher, but as someone who had shared a secret that would not fade. As the years passed, Adrian visited now and then. His hair turned gray, and he walked with a slight stoop. Each time, he brought news, of exhibitions, of people who had seen Elias's work and left changed. Some had come to the valley just to find the place where those paintings were born. A few had even stood outside his gate, not knocking, just standing in quiet gratitude before walking away. Elias never sought them out. He liked that silence could travel without needing him to follow. On one of Adrian's visits, they sat by the fire. The window was frosted, the world outside pure white. The two men sat in long silence before Adrian said, "You've given something rare to the world, Elias. Most art speaks loudly. Yours listens." Elias shook his head gently. "I didn't give it," he said. "I only learned to hear it." Adrian smiled. "That's the same thing." They sat quietly again. The logs cracked softly in the hearth, and the air smelled of pine and candle wax. Adrian stayed the night in the small guest room, and in the morning he left before dawn. Elias watched him disappear into the pale light, knowing it might be the last time. He didn't feel sorrow, only gratitude that silence had given him such companions. After that winter, Elias painted less. His movements grew slower, his hands sometimes trembling. But when he did paint, the canvases were softer than ever, faint washes of color, whispers of landscape, the ghost of a horizon. He no longer tried to shape the silence. He simply let it pass through him. He spent long afternoons sitting by the window, watching light shift across the room. Sometimes he would hum, not a tune, but a note, barely audible. He said it helped him feel the world breathe. In those moments, he felt that his paintings, his quietness, his years, all were part of the same stillness, all dissolving gently into it. The silence had taken him in, not as a possession, but as a friend. One spring evening, when the wind carried the smell of thawing earth and distant rain, a young woman came walking up the hill. Elias saw her through the window before she knocked. Her hair was darker now, and she wore a long coat, but her eyes were unmistakable. He opened the door before she could knock. "Leora," he said softly. She smiled, her face bright with both joy and something tenderly sad. "You knew it was me." "I could hear you," he said. They embraced quietly. Inside, she looked around the small cottage, the same shelves, the same cracked window pane, the same easel by the wall. Only the air felt different, richer, deeper, filled with a lifetime of quiet. She unpacked a small roll of canvases. "I brought you something." He unrolled them on the table. Her paintings were of the city, street corners after rain, people seen from behind, empty benches in dawn fog. But there was silence in them, unmistakable. Not emptiness, not loneliness, but presence. He traced one with his trembling hand. "You've learned to paint listening," he said. She nodded. "You taught me that silence isn't still. It moves through us." He looked at her for a long moment, and his eyes grew damp. "Then the silence has found another home." She stayed for several days, helping him around the house, cooking simple meals. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, talking softly or not at all. Sometimes she read aloud from her sketchbook, not stories, just fragments, the sound of sunlight on old bricks, the hush between strangers at the same window, the pause before music begins. He loved those little phrases. They felt like brushstrokes made of air. One night, as rain murmured outside, Leora asked, "Do you ever wish you had painted noise again, cities, people, voices?" Elias smiled faintly. "No. The silence has all of them in it. If you listen deeply enough, you'll hear everything." After she left, the cottage felt quieter, but not empty. Her laughter lingered in the walls, soft and golden. He knew she would carry the silence forward. The thought comforted him more than anything. The following autumn, he fell ill. It was not sudden, but slow, a tiredness that deepened each day, as though his body was turning into the same hush he had painted for so long. He didn't fight it. He spent his last weeks by the window, looking out at the valley he had loved. Sometimes he dreamed of the lake, glowing under moonlight. Sometimes he dreamed of his paintings, not hanging in galleries, but floating in the air, translucent, fading into the world around them. And sometimes he dreamed of nothing at all, just silence, pure and endless, like rest. One morning, as frost sparkled on the grass, he woke to a stillness deeper than any before. He sat up slowly, looked around the room one last time, and whispered, "It's beautiful." Then he closed his eyes. The brush slipped gently from his hand. The room remained utterly quiet for a long while. Then the wind moved through the chimney, soft and low, like breath. They found him sitting there later that day, peaceful, a faint smile on his lips. On the easel stood his final canvas, almost blank, just a wash of pale blue with the softest curve of light, like the horizon seen through fog. On the back, in his careful handwriting, he had written one word: listen. Word of his passing spread slowly, like a whisper moving through the valley. Villagers came to his cottage, standing in respectful silence. Leora arrived a week later, her eyes full of both grief and calm. She stayed for days, sorting through his things, tending the garden, and watching the light move through the empty rooms. When she found the final painting, she wept, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. She felt that Elias had not left, he had only become quieter. Later, she took that painting to the city, to Adrian's gallery. They hung it in a small, white room with no music, no chairs, no signs. Just the painting, the word on its back, and the soft hum of air. People came. They stood before it, and slowly, their breathing changed. The noise of the city seemed to fade outside the door. Some stayed only minutes, others stayed hours. A few left with tears, others with faint smiles. None could explain what they felt, only that it was peaceful. Leora stood in a corner, watching. When someone asked her what the painter had meant by his final work, she said simply, "He didn't mean." He listened. She went on to paint her own silences, not like his, but born from the same place. She taught others to listen too, to light, to air, to the pauses between their own thoughts. And in that way, Elias's silence kept spreading, not as sound, not as memory, but as a way of seeing. Years later, when the valley had long forgotten his name but not his peace, travelers still came upon the cottage by the lake. It stood weathered, quiet, open to the wind. Inside, dust floated through the light like tiny slow stars. Sometimes they swore they could hear a faint sound, not a voice, not music, but something softer, the whisper of brushes against canvas, or the heartbeat of a man who once painted silence until it spoke. If they listened long enough, they would feel it, a hush that wrapped around them, warm and infinite. And the world, for a moment, would breathe a little slower. Years passed gently, as years often do when one learns to live slowly. After Elias's passing, Leora stayed in the valley through another winter. She couldn't bring herself to leave right away. The cottage had become a place of breath rather than sorrow. Every wall seemed to remember his calm. The window still caught the morning light in the same soft way. The floor still creaked in the rhythm she'd come to know, and the air, even when utterly still, carried the faint scent of turpentine and pine smoke. She would wake early, light the fire, and sit in the same chair where he once sat, her sketchbook open, though sometimes she drew nothing at all. She just listened. The valley had changed her, as it had once changed him. It taught her that silence wasn't something to escape from, but something to grow within. When the thaw came, she finally packed her things, brushes, a few canvases, and one small jar of dried herbs Marin had given her long ago. She locked the door, not to seal the place, but to let it rest. "You're home now," she whispered to the cottage. "And I'll carry you with me." The journey to the city was long. Trains, carriages, crowds. At first, the noise pressed against her like a storm. She could feel her heartbeat quicken under it, the pulse of movement everywhere. But then she began to notice something deeper, the quiet beneath the sound. It was the same silence Elias had taught her to hear, patient, listening, eternal. She rented a small room near the river. The window looked out over rooftops and chimneys. The city was not beautiful in the way the valley was, but it had its own kind of rhythm, a breathing of light and movement. Leora set up her easel and began to paint again. Her first works were small. She painted rain on stone steps, reflections of street lamps and puddles, the silence of a cafe after closing. People began to notice. There was something strange about her paintings. They felt alive but still, as if they were holding their breath. A gallery owner who had once worked with Adrian came to visit her. He stood before one of her canvases for a long time before saying, "It's as if I can hear nothing and everything." Leora smiled. "That's what I learned from my teacher." He offered to show her work in the same quiet gallery where Elias's paintings had once hung. When she entered that space for the first time, years after his death, she felt her chest tighten. The room still carried his calm. Some of his paintings remained, soft and faint, like distant echoes. Seeing them again, she whispered, "You're still here." Her own paintings were hung beside his, silence speaking to silence. Visitors came, and though few spoke aloud, their faces told her everything. Some smiled with closed eyes. Some wept quietly. One man whispered to her, "It feels like remembering who I was before I forgot." She thanked him softly. Over time, she began to teach. It started with a single student, a boy who could not focus, whose mind was full of noise. His parents brought him to her because they'd heard she painted calmness. She didn't know how to teach him at first, so she did what Elias had done for her. She simply let him sit in quiet. At first he squirmed, restless. Then one day, he stopped fidgeting and stared out the window. "The air hums," he said. Leora smiled. "Yes. That's the beginning." More students came. She didn't teach them how to paint things, not trees or faces or light, but how to paint the space around things. How to listen before touching the canvas. How to breathe before mixing color. She would say, "If you listen long enough, the world will show you what it wants to be." Her studio grew into a small sanctuary. People came not only to paint but to rest. Some came just to sit. The noise of their lives softened there. The walls held that same warmth the valley once had, not because of her alone, but because silence had chosen to live there again. One evening, after her students had gone, she sat alone in the studio. The air was dim with twilight. She took out the letter Elias had written to Adrian long ago, the one she'd kept folded in her sketchbook. "If silence can travel gently, then let it go." She smiled, whispering, "It has, Elias. It's still traveling." She began a new series of paintings then, called Echoes. They were less like landscapes, more like dreams, soft clouds of tone and light, the faintest traces of human presence. In one, the shape of a chair. In another, a window with no view. And in each one, a small, almost invisible glimmer, the suggestion of someone having once been there, listening. Those paintings traveled farther than she ever did. They hung in museums, in quiet corners of libraries, even in hospitals where people sought comfort. But to Leora, they were not hers. They belonged to the silence, she would say. Years rolled on gently. Her hair turned silver. Her hands, though thinner now, still moved with care. Her students grew up and began to teach others, not all painters, but musicians, poets, and even doctors. They all carried a piece of her calm. One wrote her a letter from another country. "When I play, I wait before the first note. That pause, that's where I hear him." Leora knew who he meant. Sometimes she returned to the valley. The path grew overgrown, the gate rusted. The cottage stood unchanged, wrapped in ivy, its windows dusty but intact. Inside, dust motes floated like memories in sunlight. She would sit where Elias once sat, close her eyes, and listen. The silence welcomed her back, warm and full, like water around a stone. Once, while sitting there, she thought she heard the faint scrape of a brush. It could have been the wind. It could have been him. She smiled and said softly, "Still painting?" The years became quiet companions. Leora no longer needed to paint often. Her silence had moved beyond the canvas. She found it in the way she poured tea, the way she greeted the morning, the way she watched the world pass without reaching to hold it. One winter evening, as snow fell outside her window, she sat at her table and began to write a letter. It was addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. She wrote, "Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of love without demand. It is the stillness that holds us when we forget to breathe. It is what remains when everything else fades." She folded the letter and placed it inside a drawer with a small label, "For whoever listens next." When she passed, many years later, her students gathered in her studio. They didn't speak for a long time. They simply stood in silence, the same kind she had taught them to honor. Then one of them, a young woman with calm eyes, said quietly, "She didn't leave. She just became quieter." They kept her studio open. People still came, some to paint, some only to sit. On the wall hung one of her final paintings, a small cottage under moonlight, surrounded by mist. It was Elias's home, though no one but her students knew. Beneath it, carved into a simple plaque, were two words she had requested long ago: "Listen closer." And so the silence continued, through their hands, through their art, through the hush that fell each evening when the light grew soft. Somewhere far from the city, in the valley where it had all begun, the wind still moved gently through the pines. The cottage still stood. The door creaked in the same rhythm as before. Inside, if one listened long enough, one could almost hear it, the soft brush against canvas, the breath between thoughts, the eternal, tender heartbeat of stillness. And the world, for a little while longer, stayed beautifully quiet. Years later, after Leora's passing, the city kept changing, faster, louder, brighter. But inside a narrow street near the river, the little studio she'd built remained. Its door, painted the color of dried lavender, bore a tiny brass plate that read, "The Quiet Atelier." It was cared for now by Mira, one of Leora's youngest students. Mira had come to her as a restless girl, a violinist who could never play a piece the same way twice. Her bow hand trembled, her heart raced with every sound. She had once told Leora, "I don't know how to stop hearing everything at once." Leora had only smiled, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then start by hearing one thing, your breath." That was the beginning. Mira learned not only to play, but to listen. She practiced for years under Leora's patient eye, learning to hear silence as the pulse between notes. Now, grown and graceful, she stood in that same studio, the scent of turpentine and varnish mingling with the faint sweetness of jasmine. The walls were covered with Leora's students' paintings, each one a doorway into stillness. Every morning, Mira would open the windows and let the air wander in. She never spoke for the first hour of the day. Sometimes she would take out her violin and draw the bow across the strings, barely touching, letting the note hover just above silence, so soft it seemed more imagined than heard. That, she often thought, was where Leora still lived, in the space between sound and nothing. People came to her now, just as they had once come to Leora. But she didn't call herself a teacher. "I only remind people to listen," she would say. Her classes were small: painters, musicians, writers, even dancers who wanted to move without chasing the rhythm. They would sit in a circle of sunlight, eyes closed, learning how to breathe. She would ask them to listen to the ticking of a clock, then to the faint hum beyond it, and then to what came after, the deep, wordless quiet that had no name. "Do you hear it?" she'd whisper. And they always did, eventually. One day, as dusk slipped over the city, Mira found an old key in one of Leora's drawers. It was tied with a ribbon and labeled in Leora's delicate handwriting, "The Valley." Her heart stirred. She had heard of the place often, the way Leora spoke of it, as though it were a living thing, a sanctuary where silence itself had been born. She decided to go. The journey took her far from the city, through hills and rivers, until the air grew cool and clear. When she reached the valley, she felt as if the world had taken a long, deep breath and finally exhaled. The cottage stood just as Leora had described, small, ivy-clad, a single window glowing faintly with moonlight. The door opened easily, the hinges sighing in a familiar tone, and the air inside smelled of pine, earth, and time. Dust floated like quiet snow in the lamplight. On the wall hung an old painting, Leora's, perhaps, or maybe Elias's, of the sea under a gray sky. The brushwork was soft, deliberate, like a whisper caught in color. Mira walked through the small rooms, touching nothing. She sat by the window, as Elias had, as Leora had, and set her violin on her lap. Outside, the wind murmured through the trees, carrying the same slow rhythm that had once lulled them both. She closed her eyes and began to play. The music was simple, a few notes, stretched and soft, almost like breathing. The sound blended with the valley's hush until it was impossible to tell where the melody ended and silence began. In that moment, she understood what both her teachers had meant. Silence was not an absence, it was a presence so full it could hold everything: sorrow, joy, memory, light. It was the space that allowed all other things to exist. As she played, she felt something, not quite a sound, not quite a vision, but a knowing. Elias, somewhere beyond time, painting quietly. Leora, watching gently beside him, her hands folded and calm. Both smiling. When the last note faded, the valley didn't feel empty. It felt complete. Mira stayed there through the night, painting by lamplight, her first painting in months. She painted the sound of her violin as it dissolved into the quiet, the faint glow of moonlight on the strings, and the invisible rhythm of stillness that held it all together. When she finished, she set the brush down and whispered, "For you." The next morning, the first snow fell. She hung the painting on the wall of the cottage and left the door slightly open as she walked away, so that the silence could travel freely. Back in the city, she reopened the quiet atelier and placed a small note above the door, the same words Leora had once written: "Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of love without demand." Years would pass. New students would come, restless hearts and trembling hands. And she would teach them as she had been taught, not how to perfect, but how to listen. The world outside would grow louder, faster. But inside that small room, time would slow, and the same quiet would bloom again and again. Sometimes, when the evening light fell across her desk, Mira would hear it, faint but unmistakable, the soft brushstroke of a memory, the sigh of wind and pines, the hum of a silence too vast for words. And in that soundless harmony, the lineage continued: Elias's stillness, Leora's peace, Myra's song, threads of quiet woven through the noise of centuries. The silence lived on, not in any one place, but in every heart that learned to stop and listen. And though the world kept spinning, somewhere, beneath all the motion, there was always this, a gentle, unbroken calm, painted once by a lonely artist who learned to capture the sound of stillness, and shared it with everyone who remembered to breathe.